I would like to thank the University of Leipzig for this esteemed invitation. In particular, I want to thank Vice Rector Miedel, the head of the recent Globe, and Fabian Michl, with whom I recently collaborated on German electoral legislation, and with whom the collaboration will continue in the next months and years. But especially next month, because Fabian is expected to come to Brescia in September. The topic I was asked to speak about combines the issue of constitutional reforms in Italy with the characters of the type of right-wing populism currently dominating the Italian government, and it requires some preliminary clarifications. Firstly, I would like to clarify in what sense I use the notion of right-wing populism in this presentation. The first clarification is that I take for granted that the larger part of the current governing majority in Italy consists of political forces that easily fit into the category of right-wing populism, at least if you take in account their public discourse. The attribution of the current majority in Parliament to the family of the right-wing populism is quite clear from this point of view. In particular, this is undoubtedly the case for Lega Nord and Fratelli d'Italia, two of the major parties in government at the moment. Both advocate law and order issues and the notion that states should be inhabited exclusively by members of the native group, the nation, and that non-native alien elements fundamentally threaten the homogeneous nation state. These, combined with a rhetoric that opposes real people interests, as they say, to that of perverted elites, is probably enough for ascribing the government to right-wing populism. Indeed, these two forces combined obtained 35% of the votes in the 2022 elections. This constitutes the 4/5 of the votes obtained by the center-right as a whole, amounting to 45% of total votes, which translated into about 60% of the seats in both chambers in Italy. The remaining fifth of the electorate of the center-right coalition is attributed to Forza Italia, the party once led by Berlusconi, which now appears as a mainstream party, but also has quite clear populist roots. However, if one takes into account the policies actually implemented by the government led by these political groups, the evaluation becomes more ambiguous. Fratelli d'Italia, the party of Giorgia Meloni, the current head of government, has a very pro-Atlantic stance on the issue of Ukraine. The government as a whole has eased tensions with the European Union. In particular, the relations between Meloni and von der Leyen are very good, and no significant measures have been taken on grounds as immigration, abortion, homosexuality, and so on. Therefore, as a first assessment, we cannot take for granted that the governing majority in Italy can be classified as right-wing populist. As I will try to argue, it is precisely in the realm of the conception of the constitution and democracy that it is easier to find the elements that allow us to classify the center-right government in Italy within the family of populism. In this area, in fact, proposed policies and public discourse seems to align. The second clarification regarding the notion of right-wing populism concerns the second part of the binomial, id est populism. I do not try to provide a precise definition of populism. Indeed, I think it's a very complicated operation, especially for a lawyer as I am. I would leave this task to political scientists or legal theorists who seem better equipped on this point. Instead, I try to limit my presentation on right-wing populism to the constitutional implications of populism in the matter of constitutional reforms. For the sake, I start from the assertion that the themes on which populist political forces distinguish themselves are generally three, at least according to Italian perspective. As an expression of the anti-elitist nature of populist parties, often they contrast the institutions of representative democracy with those of direct democracy. The emphasis on the use of referendums as an alternative to legislation by parliament is sometimes a way of articulating a classic populist discourse that opposes the true will of the people, as they say, to that of the elites who dominate not only the economy, but the institutions as well. This kind of populist approach to constitutional issues in Italy has been typical of the Five Star Movement, a party that was in government in the previous legislature. In my opinion, when that political force was in government, a constitutional reform project was proposed with this aim. It provided for a form of popular legislative initiative followed by a referendum on the Swiss model. In my opinion, it was a quite balanced proposal that was not in opposition to parliamentary representation. However, I must specify that although I was not part of that movement, I work on that project within the government. Therefore, my judgment should be taken with some caution. In any case, this kind of ultra-democratic populist approach, which perhaps indeed belongs more to left-wing populism, is not all present in the current right-wing populist government. Thus, it falls outside of the scope of our investigation today. Second, the second clarification aims to highlight a peculiarity of Italian right-wing populism compared to that of other European countries, such as Poland and Hungary in particular. A typical feature of populism, not just right-wing actually, is certainly a poor relationship with the liberal aspects of constitutionalism. It has the need to limit power in general and democratic power as well. The typically populist need to free the people, as they say, from the constraints of constitutional forms has often led populist governments to rid themselves of one of the typical defense mechanisms provided by liberal constitutionalism. I'm referring namely to constitutional review. This is undoubtedly the case with the domestication of the constitutional courts in Poland and Hungary. In any case, this approach to constitutional limits, which involves threatening constitutional courts and constitutional review, does not apply to the Italian case. At least at the moment, there are no attacks in Italy from the right-wing populist government on the Constitutional Court, its role, or its appointment methods. Third, the dissatisfaction with the liberal dimension of constitutionalism, however, does not only take the form of criticism of constitutional review in populistic discourse. Often, it takes the form of a real intolerance for the role of parliament as the place of representation. In this sense, right-wing populism is clearly anti-parliamentary, since parliaments are places where the mythical unitary representation of the people which is a trope of the populist discourse, is broken down into its pluralistic and contradictory components to be mediated in the construction of the political will of the institutions. And consequently, it is a way of being populist that emphasizes the role of the executive at the expense of the parliament. The connection between populism and anti-parliamentarism probably does not need much argumentation, at least regarding the Italian case. Consider, for example, the experience of fascism, which, at least in its early stages, it has a clearly populist and specifically anti-parliamentary connotation. Indeed, the populist nature of fascism, at least in its origins, is largely asserted by intellectuals like Luigi Ferraioli, Umberto Eco, or Antonio Scurati. Just look at the Prime Minister Mussolini's first speech to the Chamber of Deputies on 1922, when the Mussolini government was still a parliamentary government supported by a majority of liberals and members of the Catholic Party. Mussolini, in that case, famously stated that, I quote, "the Italian people, in its better part, had given itself a government outside, above, and against any designation of parliament." Adding laconically, I could have made this deaf and great hall a bivouac of squads. I could have barred parliament and constituted a government exclusively of fascists. I could have, but did not want to, at least at this first time. This is a very famous quotation of Mussolini at the beginning of his regime. Therefore, in essence, I limit the subject of this discussion on right-wing populism and constitutional reforms in Italy to the theme of anti-parliamentarism as a stream of populism that dominates the current government's approach to reforms. Finally, having delimited the topic, a methodological specification is needed. The theme of parliament within the constitutional system obviously pertains to the form of government, which does not only consist of formally constitutional norms, it implies a special role, at least for electoral provisions, which in Italy, as in Germany, are formally legislative. Therefore, I will deal with materially constitutional provisions, but not always formally constitutional ones. The anti-parliamentarism of the current majority in Parliament on the subject of constitutional reforms clearly emerges, in my opinion, and I would say in the majority of Italian scholars' opinion, from the draft constitutional reform bill on the introduction of what in Italy has been called premierato and its consequences on electoral legislation. With this very untechnical expression, the premierato, we essentially refer to a series of parliamentary forms of government generally grouped because they realize a form of prominence of the executive. In essence, in the Italian public opinion, this category would include very different forms of government, from the UK model to the German chancellorship. These are forms of government that would achieve greater strength and stability for the executives, with the government being derived from a direct choice by the voters, at least according to the conceptualization provided by political science and then very uncritically adopted by constitutional scholarship. In truth, the premierato is a model of government that does not have much to do with the mentioned examples. These examples constitute variants of the parliamentary form of government with some rationalization. Rather, the premierato is a category that recalls the so-called neo parliamentarianism of Maurice Duverger and has found concrete implementation in Italy at the sub-state levels of government, as I will explain later in the presentation. But anyway, the aim of the reform proposed, in fact, is twofold. First, the need to make Italian governments more stable. Second, the need to allow a direct voice of voters in the formation of government. Regarding the need to make Italian governments more stable, there is little to say. Italy has had around 70 governments, different governments in 80 years. It should only be noted that the governmental instability for many years was accompanied by exceptional stability in the political formula, an expression which means the set of parties in support of the government and the party dominating the executive, the Christian Democrats, which led the country from 1946 until 1992. Instability became endemic regarding majority political formulas only after the fall of the Berlin Wall. In fact, in Italy, the fall of the Iron Curtain led to the complete collapse of the so-called First Republic's party system, the emergence of new political forces, and a populist-type dominance in the center-right led by Silvio Berlusconi. Second, regarding the need to give voters a direct voice in forming the government within the limits of constitutional democracy, I think it is a completely legitimate political objective, given that in Italy those political conventions that in other countries with a parliamentary form of government have made the leadership of the government rather predictable by the voters have never operated in Italy. However, this political objective is pursued through a very questionable technique and, as I will try to say, reveals the anti-parliamentary and populist nature of the majority's approach to the constitutional form of government. It is now necessary to see how these political objectives, allowing the voters to influence the leadership of the government and stabilizing it, are pursued. To this end, the government's proposal introduces the direct election of the prime minister by the voters. It does not adopt a presidential form of government like that of the United States of America, nor a semi-presidential form of government like the French one. In fact, it adopts a form of government similar to that experimented by Israel between 1992 and 1997. That form of government, with a direct election of the head of the government, did not work in Israel, mainly because while maintaining the trust relationship between government and parliament, it elected a head of the government, often unable to find a majority in the chamber. To avoid this malfunctioning of the Israeli experiment, the Italian government's reform proposal finds a drastic solution which, as we will see later, seems to be distinctively anti-parliamentary and populist. Indeed, the reform provides that the elected president must be granted by law an absolute majority of seats in both chambers for party lists formally connected to him or her. This is the core of the project. Moreover, to stabilize the parliamentary majority, the president is granted the power to dissolve the chambers if they express a vote of no confidence in him or her. It seems to me that the core of the reform reveals the anti-parliamentary nature of the majority's approach to constitutional reforms in these terms. First, The mechanism ensures that the composition of the chambers is no longer the direct result of the voter's choice in an election that concerns the member of parliament. Indeed, the composition of the chambers will be a derivative of the election of the government's head. Once the prime minister is elected, he must be granted a majority of seats in all cases in both chambers. The method of electing the prime minister, whether in one round or in 2 rounds, is not specified in the constitutional reform. What is specified, however, is that whatever the case, the president must be granted an absolute majority of seats in both chambers to party lists connected to him or her. And this includes the following scenarios. He or she is assured a majority of seats even when the coalition linked to the losing candidate has more votes than the winning one, and even when it has an absolute majority of votes. He or she is assured a majority even when he is linked to lists for parliament elections that have very little support. For example, a famous person capable of attracting many votes to himself, but without connections to traditional political forces. He could win, let's say, with 41% of the votes as a candidate prime minister and be linked to lists, to party lists that perhaps obtain only 10 or even 5% of the votes. These lists would have 51% of the seats in the 2 chambers. And the same in case of a runoff. It could happen that the second candidate in the first round, let's say with 39%, the first with 39% of the vote and the second with 25% of the votes, there will be a runoff between the 2 candidates. The second candidate can win the runoff, of course, and the list links to him, perhaps with 30 or even 30% of the votes, will get the prize. It has the 51% of the seats in parliament. He or she is assured a majority of seats in the chambers, even when he wins with the decisive support of Italians abroad. There are 5 million Italians abroad, while voters in Italy are about 50 million. Currently, these voters elect only 12 MPs out of 600. But in the election of the prime minister, their vote will weigh as much as that of Italians in Italy, of course. And if the president wins with the decisive contribution of Italians abroad, they could potentially shift hundreds of seats elected in Italy, as we will see later. The political legitimacy of the MPs elected this way will be very low. They are elected as a function of the premier's election, not for the votes they gather of themselves. This is delegitimating for the parliament and uproots the possibility of reconstructing a normally structured party system. Moreover, they will be parliamentarians significantly limited in their freedom. They are elected with the purpose of supporting a prime minister, and if they vote against him, the prime minister can dissolve the parliament. The attribution of the proposal to populist anti-parliamentarism naturally betrays a conception of democracy intolerant of the limits and forms according to which it must be carried out based on the principles of liberal democratic constitutionalism. In particular, it seems to be in clear tension with the principle of the separation of powers, which operates even in parliamentary forms of government. In fact, the liberal democratic forms of government differ regarding the legitimation of the executive In presidential systems, it is direct from the people, while in parliamentary systems, it is derived from parliament. However, comparative constitutional law does not offer examples of the indirect derivation of parliament from the executive's election, like in the proposal of the government. When there is direct election of the executive, as in presidential system, moreover, a greater system of checks and balances functions. Just think of the US system with its checks and balances mechanism, which are not present in the reform proposal at all. In the US, the houses have completely autonomous legitimacy. The president can indeed be in the minority, not only in one, but in both houses. The House of Representatives is subject to renewal after 2 years. The Senate during presidential elections is renewed only by 1/3. Moreover, the president can never dissolve the houses. None of these guarantees is present in the government project. That said, I would like to try and offer a further consideration. While it seems clear to me that the current majority's proposal is populist in nature, I fear I must specify that this approach in Italy is not specifically attributable only to the right. Indeed, proposals and implementations of such forms of government have characterized the entire constitutional history of Italy since the 20s, reappearing now and then throughout the last century. Similar systems are already operating in Italy at different levels of government. And third, a good part of political forces, not only right-wing but also center and left-wing, have advocated in different periods similar proposals. In essence, it seems to me that the anti-parliamentarian approach demonstrated by the right-wing populist forces currently in government is not specifically right-wing, but rather realizes a much more common and permanent populist anti-parliamentarianism widespread in Italian political system. I think I can try to demonstrate this assessment through some historical references capable of showing that systems like the one proposed have been very widely cross-party in Italian political system for a long time. These are mechanisms that in fact alter the composition of the representative assemblies with a majority bonus for the winner, for the head of the executive. Even when this has been provided for without an explicit legal provision for the direct election of the executive's head, it does not change the sense of the overall mechanism. These are mechanisms do not present in any democracy in the world, as long as I know, with the partial exception of Greece. Let's look at some of these examples and how do the mechanism work. The first example is the Acerbo law, 1923, named after the deputy who drafted it. It was an electoral law adopted in the 1924 Italian general election. It introduced a majority bonus to the proportional system. It was wanted by Mussolini to ensure a solid parliamentary majority for the National Fascist Party, but it was voted for by People's Party and liberal MPs. The fascists at the time had just 35 deputies out of 535 in that chamber. The new system modified the proportional system in place, but by integrating it with a fixed quote majority bonus of 2/3 of the seat of the chamber for the most voted party, provided it surpassed the 25% threshold. The second example is the Scelba law, and I passed through it. The third example is from 1953. The third example is the law of March 25, 1993, number 81, voted by the center and the left parties. It is an Italian state law that regulates the election of mayors, presidents of the provinces, and the municipal and provincial councils. It is commonly identified as the law that introduced in Italy the direct election of the mayor by citizens. The mayor is elected in the first round if he or she obtains more than 50% of the votes. Otherwise, a runoff is held between the top two. The coalition of parties supporting the winner is granted, in any case, 60% of the seats in the assembly. I give you an example because it's an example of what it would work a system like that, which is the same the government is proposing for national level. As you can see, this is a 2012 Parma municipality election. The mayor the candidate mayor presented by the Five-Star Movement obtained in the first round the 20% of votes, more or less. The center-left candidate obtained the 40% of votes, more or less. So there was a runoff between the two. The Five-Star Movement got the 60% of the votes, and the center-left coalition candidate stuck in the 40% of votes. But as you can see, the allocation of seats in the assembly is like that. The party with the 90% of the votes for the assembly took 21 seats out of 33, which means 2/3 of the seats, because the mayor is granted a majority of seats when for party linked to him. This is exactly the system that the government has in its mind for national level. And so more or less the same, actually, it works at regional levels in Italy. The only difference is that there are not two rounds, so the most voted president of the region got the position, and the lists linked to him or her are awarded the 55 or 60% of the seats in any case. And other examples are, for example, the constitutional proposal, a constitutional reform proposal by the center-right coalition in 2005 was more or less the same mechanism, but it was rejected by popular referendum in 2006. But this is another example, is the electoral law in place from 2005 until 2014. It was again a proportional system with a majority bonus, and the winner coalition was granted the 55% of the seats. These are the real results of 2013. There's a mistake, the 2013, not 14 elections. These are the results. The center-left coalition led by Luigi Bersani got 29.55% of the votes. The center-right, led by Silvio Berlusconi, got 29.18. It means they had just 100,000 votes of difference. But because the center-left won, the center-left was granted 340 seats, with the same votes, actually, as the center-right coalition, that got 124 seats. As you can see, for example, the Democratic Party with 25% of the votes, which is less than the Five-Star Movement, 25.56, so they are 20 or 30,000 votes more for the five-star movements, and the five-star movements got 100 seats, and the Democratic Party got, with less votes, 300 seats, which is the triple actually. And these are another example on how this mechanism works in manipulating the result of the election in order to ensure a majority of seats to the winner for another position. This electoral law was declared unconstitutional by the Constitutional Court in 2014 after these results, but anyway was used in 3 elections in Italy unless it was unconstitutional. The last example is more or less similar to this electoral law. In 2016, the Renzi government, which means the center-left government, proposed a mechanism very similar to this one, with some change, but very similar, and the Constitutional Court declared it unconstitutional before using it this time. And Renzi proposed a constitutional reform, another constitutional grand reform according to this model, basically, and the people rejected it in a popular referendum again. So, based on what has been stated, some concluding consideration on the proposed theme can be made. The first is that the approach to constitutional reforms by the current right-wing majority in parliament certainly belongs to the family of populism. On the issues of Europe, immigration, civil rights, however, the center-right majority appears to display clear contradictions between public discourse and the policies actually implemented. This is not the case regarding constitutional reforms. Second, the populism of the current majority in government in terms of constitutional reforms seems characterized by its anti-parliamentarian nature, emphasizing the power of the executive at the expense of the effectiveness of parliamentary representation, almost as if democracy could be reduced to the identification of a single monocratic decision maker, disregarding the system of separation of powers that characterizes every liberal constitutional order, especially when the head of the executive is directly elected. Third, however, the populist anti-parliamentarianism of the center-right currently in government in Italy does not seem typically, in the Italian context, of an approach exclusively attributable to the right-wing populists. In fact, over time, the anti-parliamentarian approach has been adopted not only by center-right forces, but also, and not accidentally, by forces attributable to the center-left, which have therefore not been free from populist impulses on constitutional grounds. Fourth, curiously, on constitutional grounds, the greatest resistance to populist impulses in the anti-parliamentarian variant has not come, allow me to some simplifications, from the elites, but from the people who, through the referendum instrument, have rejected all these anti-parliamentarian grand reform attempts. Regarding the current government's latest attempt, which I try to summarize today, it does not seem that the center-right can be easily stopped in the chambers. So one might ask, will the people have to stop the populists again? Thank you.